When a commercial aircraft loses all control systems at 37,000 feet, 186 passengers face certain death as the plane plummets toward Earth. But a college student in a hoodie possesses secret knowledge that could save everyone, if the desperate pilots will trust her unconventional techniques. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. The Boeing 737-800 cut through the late afternoon sky at 37,000 feet, a silver needle threading through scattered cumulus clouds that dotted the horizon like cotton balls suspended in blue gel. Sarah Chen settled into seat 14C, her worn backpack stuffed under the seat in front of her, textbooks pressing against the fabric with enough force to create visible bulges in the navy canvas. She wore faded jeans and a university hoodie, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, looking every bit the typical college student heading home for spring break. The middle-aged woman in 14B had smiled warmly when Sarah sat down, the kind of maternal smile that adult passengers always seem to reserve for young people traveling alone. Heading home for break? The woman asked, her voice carrying that practiced friendliness that strangers on airplanes use to fill awkward silence. Sarah nodded, offering a polite smile. Yes, ma'am. Spring break finally arrived. The woman's eyes drifted to the backpack, noting the university logo embroidered on the front pocket. Oh, how wonderful. What are you studying? It was the question Sarah heard constantly, the automatic inquiry that adults posed to any college-aged person they encountered. Engineering, Sarah replied simply, deliberately leaving off the aerospace specification that would prompt follow-up questions she didn't feel like answering during a 4-hour flight. The woman nodded approvingly. That's marvelous. My son studied business at State. You engineering students work so hard with all those mathematics courses. The flight attendant passed through the cabin during her pre-flight check, offering Sarah the same cursory glance she gave every passenger, seeing nothing remarkable about the young woman in the hoodie clutching a well-worn aerospace dynamics textbook. To the crew's experienced eyes, Sarah represented just another undergraduate making the routine journey between university and home, probably worried about upcoming exams or thinking about seeing friends and family. They couldn't see the hundreds of flight hours logged in her personal record, the summers spent in her grandfather's Cessna 172 learning stick and rudder skills before most teenagers earn driver's licenses, or the intensive ROTC flight training that had her running through emergency procedures until they became pure muscle memory. Her father, a retired Air Force pilot, had trained her since childhood in the unforgiving discipline of aviation, where complacency killed and preparation meant survival. Her mother, an aerospace engineer who'd spent 3 decades designing flight control systems for major aircraft manufacturers, had filled Sarah's childhood with dinner-table conversations about hydraulic redundancies, fly-by-wire architecture, and the elegant mathematics that kept multi-ton machines aloft. Sarah had chosen her university specifically for its renowned aerospace engineering program, one of the few institutions offering undergraduate students access to flight simulators normally reserved for commercial pilot training, where she'd spent countless hours practicing scenarios that commercial pilots hoped they'd never encounter. She'd flown simulated engine failures at rotation, practiced recovering from unusual attitudes, and drilled emergency descents until her hands moved across imaginary controls with the precision of a concert pianist. But sitting in seat 14C in her college hoodie with textbooks scattered around her feet, none of that registered to the flight crew or fellow passengers who saw only the superficial markers of undergraduate life. The engines spooled up with their characteristic whine as the aircraft pushed back from the gate, the auxiliary power unit providing electrical power while ground crews disconnected jetway connections. Sarah felt the familiar sensations of taxi, the slight bumps as the nose wheel crossed pavement seams, the subtle banking as the pilot steered toward the departure runway. The climb was smooth, the autopilot guiding the aircraft through its programmed departure procedure while the pilots monitored systems and communicated with air traffic control. Sarah pulled out her laptop, ostensibly to work on a fluid dynamics assignment, though her ears remained attuned to the engine sounds and the subtle changes in cabin pressure that marked their ascent. 2 hours into the flight, Sarah was deep into a computational analysis when the first indication of trouble manifested as a sound that didn't belong in the normal acoustic environment of cruise flight. It was subtle, a change in the engine harmonics that lasted perhaps 3 seconds before returning to normal, the kind of minor anomaly that most passengers wouldn't consciously register but that set off alarm bells in Sarah's trained awareness. She glanced up from her laptop, her eyes tracking toward the wing visible through the window across the aisle, but saw nothing unusual. The flight continued normally for another 8 minutes while Sarah's attention remained divided between her assignment and her subconscious monitoring of the aircraft's sounds and sensations. The catastrophic failure began without warning, a violent explosion that sent a shockwave through the entire airframe as the right engine's turbine disintegrated at operating speed, sending superheated metal fragments tearing through containment housings designed to prevent exactly this scenario. Sarah felt the aircraft yaw sharply to the right as asymmetric thrust tried to spin the plane, simultaneously hearing the unmistakable bang of major structural damage and feeling the sickening lurch as multiple systems began failing in rapid cascade. The explosion had severed all 3 hydraulic lines running through the right-wing route, the lifeblood of the aircraft's flight control system spraying into the slipstream at 3,000 pounds per square inch. Passengers screamed as the aircraft rolled violently, overhead bins bursting open to rain luggage and personal items onto people struggling against seatbelts. Sarah's training kicked in instantly, her conscious mind taking microseconds to process what her subconscious had already concluded. Catastrophic engine failure with complete hydraulic system loss, which meant the pilots had just lost normal control of elevators, ailerons, rudder, flaps, and slats. The Boeing 737 used hydraulic pressure for nearly every flight control surface, and this failure had taken out all 3 hydraulic systems simultaneously, a scenario so unlikely that it existed in training manuals more as theoretical exercise than realistic emergency procedure. She felt the aircraft's nose pitch down sharply as the pilots fought to maintain control using the only tools remaining, differential engine thrust and limited authority of manual trim wheels. The captain's voice came over the public address system, strained but controlled. "Flight attendants, be seated immediately. Passengers remain seated with seatbelts fastened." The words were almost absurdly inadequate for the violence the aircraft was experiencing, rolling through angles that sent loose items flying across the cabin like projectiles. Sarah looked forward toward the cockpit door, her mind racing through the implications. The pilots would be running through emergency procedures, trying to regain control of an aircraft that was no longer responding to conventional inputs, while the ground rushed up toward them at a rate that would give them perhaps 3 minutes before impact. She made her decision in the span of a single heartbeat, unbuckling her seatbelt and lurching into the aisle as the aircraft rolled through another stomach-churning bank angle. A flight attendant strapped into the forward jump seat shouted at her to sit down, but Sarah ignored the command, her entire focus narrowed to reaching the cockpit before the aircraft's descent became unrecoverable. She pounded on the reinforced door with both fists, knowing the pilots could see her through the security camera. "I'm an aerospace engineering student with flight training," Sarah shouted over the screaming passengers. "I know what's happening to your aircraft and I can help." For 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours, nothing happened, but then she heard the lock mechanism disengage and the door swung inward. The first officer's face appeared in the gap, his features tight with stress. "Who are you?" he demanded, his eyes taking in Sarah's college hoodie and youthful face with obvious skepticism. "Sarah Chen, aerospace engineering student at State, 700 hours flight time including advanced emergency procedures training," she replied with clipped precision. "You've lost all 3 hydraulic systems and you're descending at approximately 4,000 feet per minute with limited flight control authority. I've trained extensively on scenarios exactly like this one." The first officer's eyes widened fractionally. Behind him, Sarah could see the captain fighting with the control yoke, his movements sharp and frustrated. The primary flight displays showed their altitude unwinding at terrifying speed, 31,000 feet, 30,000, 29,500. "Let her in," the captain barked without taking his eyes off the instruments. The first officer pulled the door fully open and Sarah squeezed into the cramped cockpit, her eyes immediately scanning the instrument panels. All 3 hydraulic system pressure gauges showed 0, confirming her diagnosis. The standby instruments showed a descent rate of 4,200 feet per minute and increasing, with the aircraft's pitch attitude 12 degrees nose down. Background, quickly, the captain demanded, his hands never stopping their dance across the controls. Sarah grabbed the back of the first officer's seat to steady herself. Father's retired Air Force, flew F-15s and then heavies. Mother's an aerospace engineer who designed flight control systems for Boeing. I've been flying since I was 12, got my private, instrument, and commercial ratings, spent last summer in an advanced flight sim program running unusual attitude recoveries and total hydraulic failure scenarios. Those are simulator games, the first officer said, his tone carrying more hope than dismissal. No sir, Sarah corrected firmly. Level D full motion simulator certified for commercial pilot training, running scenarios based on actual accidents including United 232, which was a DC-10 that lost all hydraulics over Iowa in 1989. The pilots managed to fly that aircraft for 45 minutes using only differential thrust. This aircraft has the same capability if we implement the right technique. The captain glanced at her for the first time. United 232 crashed during landing. Half the people aboard died. Sarah nodded, meeting his gaze steadily. Yes sir, but half survived, which was infinitely better than what would have happened if they'd given up. They had 45 minutes because they were at 37,000 feet. We're already down to 26,000 and falling faster. We have maybe 10 minutes to establish control before we're too low to recover. The aircraft lurched through another violent roll, and the stall warning began to chirp intermittently. The captain was pulling back on the yoke with both hands, but without hydraulic pressure the control column was just a stick connected to nothing. Talk to me, the captain said, his voice tight. What do you know that I don't? Sarah pointed at the thrust levers. Right engine's gone, but you still have full thrust authority on the left engine. You need to use rapid thrust changes to pitch the nose, not the yoke. Increase thrust quickly and the increased airflow over the tail will push the nose down. Reduce thrust and the nose will come up. It's counterintuitive because it's opposite to how power normally affects pitch, but without elevator authority, thrust is your primary pitch control. That's insane, the first officer said, but he was already looking at the thrust lever with new understanding. It's aerodynamics, Sarah countered. The horizontal stabilizer is still there, still generating forces based on airflow. You can't control it directly anymore, but you can control it indirectly by changing the airflow pattern through thrust manipulation. For bank control, you need differential thrust combined with rudder trim. The rudder's hydraulically controlled, the captain said. The trim is electrically controlled but moves the trim tabs, which still work because they're aerodynamic surfaces, Sarah explained rapidly. You won't have direct rudder control, but you can use rudder trim to create a constant side force that gives you crude but functional bank control. The captain processed this for perhaps 2 seconds. 23,000 feet, the first officer called out, his voice rising. Show me, the captain said, his hands moving away from the yoke in an act of faith that went against every fiber of his being. Sarah leaned between the seats, her hand moving to the thrust lever. First we need to arrest this descent rate. Full thrust on the left engine now. She pushed the lever to its forward stop and the remaining engine spooled up to maximum power. The captain's instinct was to fight the yaw, but Sarah was already turning the rudder trim wheel. Don't fight the yaw completely. Use it. Let the aircraft establish a slight nose-left attitude. That gives you a slip angle that creates more rudder effectiveness. The Boeing was shaking violently now, but Sarah could feel the descent rate beginning to decrease. She watched the vertical speed indicator begin to slowly climb toward -3,800, -3,500. It's working, the first officer breathed. 21,000 feet, the captain called out, but his tone had changed fractionally. Now we control pitch, Sarah said. We're descending too fast still. Quick reduction in thrust. She pulled the lever back smoothly, reducing engine power by about 30%, and the aircraft's nose immediately began to rise. Watch your airspeed. We need to maintain at least 220 knots to keep control surfaces effective. 19,000 feet, descent rate minus 2,000, the first officer announced, and Sarah could hear cautious optimism beginning to color his professional monotone. They had arrested the worst of the plummet, establishing a still dangerous but no longer immediately catastrophic rate of descent. "Where are we?" Sarah asked. "Approximately 80 nautical miles southwest of Denver International," the first officer replied. "We were 45 miles west when the failure occurred. Before you declare emergency, we need to establish whether we can realistically land this aircraft at all," Sarah said. United 232 attempted a landing with similar control degradation and crashed because they couldn't fine-tune their descent rate enough. "We might be better served finding suitable terrain for a controlled crash." The bluntness of Sarah's assessment silenced the cockpit. "With respect, sir, you have 186 souls aboard. If we attempt a conventional landing with our current limitations, we're looking at a crash that might be survivable if everything goes perfectly. But if we can find suitable terrain, we might significantly improve the survival probability." "You're talking about deliberately crashing in the wilderness," the first officer said, his voice carrying shock. "I'm talking about maximizing passenger survival," Sarah corrected. "A conventional runway requires precision we don't have. But if we have a 10-mile-long field and we can get down to 200 feet while maintaining wings roughly level, we can fly it into the ground in a semi-controlled manner." The captain was silent for a long moment, scanning the terrain display. "There," he said finally, pointing at the screen. 30 miles northeast, high desert terrain with minimal population. If we could get to that area and set up a shallow descent, we'd have space to touch down with margin for error." Sarah examined the terrain data. 17,000 feet, the first officer announced. "We need to vector toward that terrain now," Sarah said firmly. "Every minute we spend drifting is altitude we can't get back. Sir, you need to turn this aircraft northeast about 40 degrees. The captain looked at her. "You're asking me to deliberately fly away from the nearest airport toward open terrain with the intention of crash landing?" Sarah met his eyes steadily. "I'm asking you to choose the option that gives your passengers the highest probability of survival." "Flight attendants, this is the captain," finally spoke into the PA system. "We have experienced a serious emergency and have lost most flight controls. We are working to get the aircraft on the ground safely. Flight attendants prepare cabin for emergency landing." He began coordinating with Sarah on the thrust manipulation and rudder trim inputs necessary to bank the aircraft through a shallow turn. It was agonizingly slow, but gradually their heading began to swing right, moving toward a more northeasterly course. 15,000 feet, the first officer called out. He began declaring the emergency to air traffic control. "Denver Center, Coastal 447 declaring emergency. We have lost all hydraulic systems and most flight controls. Unable to maintain altitude. Request emergency services be positioned in area 30 miles northeast of current position for imminent crash landing attempt." Sarah's hands were cramping from gripping the seat back. "We need to think about touchdown configuration," she said. "Without hydraulic pressure, we have no flaps, no slats, no spoilers. We'll be landing clean configuration at high speed. Approach speed will be around 190 to 200 knots. Gear," the first officer said suddenly. "Without hydraulics, can we extend landing gear?" Sarah shook her head. "I'd recommend considering wheels-up landing. With gear down, if one strut collapses asymmetrically during ground contact, you'll get a violent roll that could cartwheel the aircraft. Wheels-up gives you a more predictable slide." "You want me to deliberately belly land this aircraft," the captain said flatly. "I want you to maximize survival probability," Sarah replied firmly. "The fuselage is designed to absorb energy during a crash. The landing gear are weak points that can fail asymmetrically. Every accident investigation shows better survival rates for controlled wheels-up landings." The captain absorbed this. 12,000 feet, the first officer announced. Sarah nodded. "That gives us time to brief passengers and prepare cabin. You should have flight attendants run through emergency landing procedures immediately. The captain picked up the PA microphone, his voice carrying the gravity of their situation. This is Captain Mitchell. We have experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure and have lost control of most flight systems. We will be making an emergency landing in approximately 8 minutes in an unprepared area. Flight attendants, begin emergency landing preparation immediately. Passengers, listen carefully to flight attendant instructions. Assume crash position when directed. Through the cockpit door, Sarah could hear the flight attendants beginning their emergency procedures. Heads down, stay down. Tighten your seatbelts. Assume crash position when I tell you. The litany of emergency commands mixed with prayers and crying. 10,000 feet, descent rate -1200, the first officer reported. Slowing to 210 knots. Sarah glanced at the airspeed indicator. Good. We want to bleed off excess speed but maintain enough energy to keep control surfaces effective. I can see the terrain, the first officer said, pointing ahead at the brown landscape. There, that looks like a long valley roughly aligned with our track. If we can stay lined up with that, we have maybe 5 miles of flat approach corridor. Sarah leaned forward to assess the terrain. That works. Sir, recommend leveling off at 1,500 feet above terrain and transitioning to a shallow approach angle. 8,000 feet, 7,500, the first officer was calling out altitude in 500-foot increments now. The captain was flying with an intensity that blocked out everything except the aircraft's response to his inputs. 6,000 feet. 5,500. 5,000. The terrain was clearly visible now, individual rocks and bushes distinguishable. 4,500. 4,000. Sarah moved closer to the center console, her hand hovering near the thrust lever. 3,500 feet. 3,000. There's our valley, the captain said. I'm lining up on the western edge. Looks like we have about 1.5 miles of smooth terrain. Sarah could see their intended touchdown zone. 2,500 feet. 2,000. Recommend reducing to 190 knots, Sarah said. The captain nodded and Sarah pulled the thrust back smoothly. 1,500 feet above ground, the first officer called out. Flight attendants, cabin secure, came the voice over the intercom. The captain activated the PA one final time. Assume crash position now. Heads down, stay down. Through the cockpit door, brace. 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 1,000 feet. 800. The ground was rushing up now. 600 feet. 400. Sarah could see individual shrubs. 200 feet. 150. Reducing thrust to idle, Sarah said, pulling the lever all the way back. 100 feet, descent rate -400. The captain was working the trim wheel frantically. 50 feet. 40. 30. Time seemed to dilate. 20. 10. Sarah's mind registered the moment of impact, the aircraft's belly striking the desert sand at 195 knots with a grinding shriek that vibrated through every rivet. The nose dropped and the forward fuselage hit with a teeth-rattling crash that threw Sarah forward against the seats. The aircraft was sliding now, plowing through sand and brush at diminishing speed. The noise was indescribable, a continuous roar of grinding, tearing, breaking sounds. The deceleration was violent but not instantly catastrophic. She could hear screaming from the cabin mixed with the deeper groans of the airframe structure. The slide seemed to last forever, seconds stretching as metal scraped across sand, but gradually the enormous friction forces bled away their speed. 150 knots became 100, then 80, then 60. 40 knots. 30. 20. 10. The Boeing 737-800, or what remained of it, finally shuddered to a complete stop. For perhaps 3 seconds, there was relative silence. Then the emergency systems began activating, evacuation slides deploying with their characteristic whooshing pops. Evacuate. Evacuate. Leave everything. Move to the exits. Sarah pulled herself upright, her shoulder screaming in protest. The captain was already unbuckling his harness. Check the cabin, he ordered the first officer. Get everyone out. Now. He turned to Sarah. You saved this aircraft. You saved everyone aboard. Sarah shook her head. We saved them, sir. But we need to get them away from the fuselage before anything catches fire. The smell of fuel reached the cockpit, and both pilots' eyes widened. Out, now, the captain commanded. The cabin was chaos of deployed oxygen masks, hanging overhead bins, and passengers struggling to unbuckle. The flight attendants were magnificent, physically grabbing passengers and pushing them toward exits. Move. Keep moving. Do not stop. Sarah joined the evacuation effort, grabbing an elderly man and releasing his seatbelt buckle, then guiding him toward the nearest exit. The cabin was filling with hazy white smoke. Sarah helped several more passengers, then spotted a young child crying in a seat while adults rushed past. She fought against the flow, reaching the child and lifting him. His mother appeared, bleeding from a cut above her eye. I have him, Sarah said, transferring the boy to his mother's arms. She continued sweeping aft, checking rows systematically. She found one older man unconscious, checked his pulse, found it strong, and dragged him into the aisle. A flight attendant appeared beside her. I've got him, he said, and together they manhandled him to the exit and sent him sliding down. That's everyone, the flight attendant shouted. Sarah nodded and together they went down the slide. All around her, passengers were stumbling away from the wrecked aircraft, some crying, some helping injured, many in shocked silence. The fuselage was cracked in 3 places, the tail section separated and lying 30 feet behind, but the cabin structure had held. Move away from the aircraft, the captain was shouting. At least 100 yards. Move now. The crowd began shuffling away, creating distance from the fuel-soaked structure. They reached what the captain deemed a safe distance, and there the forward momentum finally stopped as passengers collapsed in the sand, their adrenaline exhausted. The flight attendants were doing head counts. Sound off by sections. Voices responded through the entire manifest. Everyone accounted for, the senior flight attendant reported. 186 souls, all alive. The captain's face suddenly crumpled, tears streaming down his cheeks as the weight of command lifted and the reality overwhelmed him. Sarah understood, they'd been minutes from death, and somehow they'd cheated the statistics. The first officer was on the radio. All passengers and crew evacuated safely. Multiple minor injuries, no apparent fatalities, request medical support for 186 survivors. In the distance, sirens wailed, emergency vehicles approaching. Within minutes the first rescue vehicles appeared, bouncing across the desert. Paramedics spread through the survivors, doing rapid triage. A paramedic reached Sarah, noting her protective posture around her shoulder. Let me see that. He probed the joint. Separated shoulder, possibly fractured clavicle. Can you walk to the ambulance? Sarah nodded, accepting his help to stand. As he guided her toward emergency vehicles, she looked back at the broken airplane, at passengers being loaded into ambulances, at the captain and first officer giving statements. She thought about the sequence of decisions that had led to this moment, the choice to stand up during emergency, the gamble that the pilots would listen. She thought about United Flight 232, where half the passengers died. She thought about her father's voice, in an emergency, you do what works, not what's comfortable. The consequences of her decisions today were 186 people alive who should have died. The Boeing 737-800 had been a falling coffin, and somehow they'd wrestled it into survivable crash landing. The paramedic was talking to her, but Sarah's attention was divided. She saw passengers being loaded into ambulances, most walking, some on stretchers, but all alive. She saw the captain approaching, his bearing once again professional. "Miss Chen," he said, his voice carrying emotion. "I don't have words adequate to express what you did today. You saved this aircraft. You saved everyone." Sarah shook her head. "You saved them, sir. You made the decision to listen to me, to try techniques that weren't in your training manual. That took courage." The captain smiled sadly. "I was out of options and out of altitude. You gave me a new option, and the aerodynamic principles you cited made logical sense. But you had to have that knowledge ready. How does a college student know these techniques?" Sarah thought carefully. "My parents both worked in aviation. My father flew fighters and then heavy transports. My mother designed flight control systems. They taught me that aviation doesn't forgive ignorance, that the only acceptable standard is excellence. They taught me about accidents, made me study accident reports, had me practice emergency scenarios until they were muscle memory. I chose aerospace engineering because I wanted to understand not just how to fly but why aircraft behave the way they do. When my university offered access to Level D simulators, I ran total hydraulic failure scenarios dozens of times, studying United 232. I never expected to use that training. I just believed that if I was going to fly, I needed to be prepared for anything." The captain nodded slowly. "Your parents trained you well. You took advantage of that training, and today that preparation saved 186 lives. I'm putting you in for a commendation from the FAA and from our airline. What you did needs to be recognized and studied." Sarah felt embarrassment flush her face. "Sir, I just did what needed to be done." The captain cut her off. "No. Most people freeze during emergencies. You had the knowledge and the courage to act on it. That combination is rare." A federal investigator was approaching, and the captain straightened. "We'll talk more later, Miss Chen. Right now you need medical attention and I need to give my statement. But I want you to know that I will personally ensure everyone knows what you did today." The paramedic guided her toward an ambulance when she heard her name being called. She turned to see several passengers approaching. "You're the college student who went into the cockpit," one man said, his voice shaking. "You helped save the plane. You saved us." Others were gathering, survivors who'd heard the story spreading. Sarah wanted to disappear, but the paramedic's hand on her shoulder kept her in place. "Thank you," a woman said, tears streaming. "Thank you for being brave enough to help. Thank you for saving my children." Sarah's vision blurred with tears she'd been holding back, the emotional dam finally breaking. "I'm just glad everyone made it out," she managed. "That's all that matters." The passengers surrounded her, some touching her arm gently, their presence a physical expression of gratitude. The paramedic finally interceded. "She needs medical attention, folks." Sarah climbed into the ambulance and settled onto the stretcher while the paramedic examined her shoulder. Through the open doors, she could see the continuing rescue operation, the steady stream of survivors being evaluated, the investigators surveying the crash site, the news helicopters overhead documenting the scene. She realized her life had just changed irrevocably, that she would forever be known as the college student who saved a plane. The anonymity of being just another undergraduate was gone. But as she looked out at the survivors, at people hugging family members they'd thought they'd never see again, she understood that the price of that notoriety was worth paying. The ambulance doors closed and the vehicle began moving. Sarah closed her eyes, exhausted beyond anything she'd ever experienced. The paramedic was saying something about shock and adrenaline crash and rest, but his words faded as Sarah drifted into exhausted half-sleep. She dreamed of falling, of aircraft tumbling from the sky, of controls that wouldn't respond. She jerked awake with a gasp. "Post-traumatic stress response," the paramedic said gently. "Completely normal. Make sure you talk to someone about it." Her phone was buzzing, dozens of missed calls and messages from her parents. Sarah composed a response. "I'm okay. Was on the flight. Everyone survived. Injured but not seriously, will call soon. She sent the message, then turned off the phone, unable to handle responses. The hospital appeared ahead, and the ambulance pulled into the emergency bay. Sarah was transferred to a gurney and wheeled into the controlled chaos of an ER preparing for mass casualties. X-rays confirmed separated shoulder, no fractures, painful but not permanently damaging. They gave her pain medication and she drifted while around her the ER processed dozens of survivors, most with minor injuries, a few with broken bones or serious lacerations, but none with life-threatening trauma. Her aerospace engineering professor appeared, his face pale with shock. "Sarah," he said unsteadily. "The news is reporting you helped fly the aircraft. Is that true?" Sarah nodded tiredly. "Total hydraulic failure, had to use differential thrust and trim. Like United 232 but faster descent. Made it work." Her professor sat heavily. "You used the simulator training. The scenarios we ran last semester." Sarah nodded. "Didn't think I'd ever need it for real. Glad we practiced." He was silent for a long moment. "I'm going to completely revise our emergency procedures curriculum based on this. If these techniques work in real emergencies, every student needs to learn them." The news broke nationally that evening, the story of the miraculous crash landing spreading across every major outlet. Sarah's university photo appeared on screens nationwide, her name trending on social media. Interview requests flooded in from every organization. Sarah's parents arrived late that night, and their relief was profound enough to make all three cry. "You used everything we taught you," her father said, his voice thick with pride. "All those hours of training. You used it all and you saved everyone." Her mother simply held Sarah's hand, refusing to let go. "The odds of surviving total hydraulic failure are essentially zero," she finally said. "What you did shouldn't have been possible. But you made it possible because you understood the systems and you had the courage to apply that knowledge under impossible pressure." The days that followed blurred together in pain medication, physical therapy, interviews with NTSB investigators, and carefully controlled media appearances. The investigation revealed that catastrophic turbine failure had sent engine fragments through all three hydraulic systems simultaneously, a failure mode so unlikely it had been considered statistically negligible. Sarah returned to university 6 weeks later, her shoulder healing and her life irrevocably changed. She was no longer just another student, she was a minor celebrity, recognized on campus, pointed out in classes. But she also recognized that her experience had value beyond her own story. She worked with professors to develop new curriculum modules on emergency procedures. She gave presentations about the importance of understanding edge cases and emergency scenarios. The FAA and the airline both recognized her with formal commendations. The captain remained a friend, saying that his entire perspective on aviation had been changed by those desperate minutes. The passengers formed a survivors group, staying in touch, and many credited Sarah with giving them a second chance at life. Sarah Chin graduated with highest honors, her senior thesis analyzing her own experience as a case study. She was recruited by multiple aerospace companies and government agencies. She chose NASA, joining their Flight Operations and Safety Division, where her unique combination of academic knowledge and real-world crisis experience made her invaluable. But she never forgot those minutes aboard Coastal Flight 447, when she'd stood up from her college student seat and walked into a cockpit where desperate pilots fought a losing battle. She never forgot the decision to speak up rather than remain silent, to offer knowledge that might be rejected rather than watch helplessly as everyone fell to certain death. Years later, giving a keynote address at an aerospace engineering conference, Sarah reflected on that day. "We train for emergencies hoping we'll never face them," she told the audience. "We study accident reports and practice scenarios in simulators, hoping it's all academic exercise. But sometimes, all that training becomes the difference between catastrophe and survival. The lesson I learned is simple: take your training seriously, understand the principles underlying your field deeply enough to apply them creatively when standard procedures fail, and have the courage to speak up when you have knowledge that can help, even if circumstances make that uncomfortable. The story of Coastal Flight 447 became a legend in aviation circles, studied in accident investigation courses and emergency procedure training, cited as an example of successful crew resource management extended to non-crew technical experts. Sarah Chun became a symbol of the value of STEM education, of preparation meeting opportunity. But for Sarah herself, the most important outcome was simpler. 186 people had gone home to their families that day, had continued their lives, had celebrated birthdays and weddings and ordinary moments that would have been forever lost if a college student hadn't stood up when an aircraft began to fall. That was what mattered more than any commendation or recognition. That was what made those terrifying minutes worth living through. She had saved 186 lives not through superhuman ability but through preparation, knowledge, courage, and willingness to act when action was required despite fear and uncertainty. The plane had been falling fast, a multi-ton machine plummeting toward Earth with everyone aboard facing certain death. Until a college student stood up and saved 186 lives using knowledge gained from textbooks and simulators, courage learned from demanding parents and instructors, and the understanding that sometimes the only difference between tragedy and survival is one person willing to act when action seems impossible.